Hello, it's Mr. Baker. I'm going to give you some information about Shakespeare's English histories. This is so we can spend more class time on the play itself, Henry IV, Part 1. After you listen to the movie and take notes, take the Google Form self-assessment quiz. Follow all the directions and you will get credit for the exercise. About a third of Shakespeare's plays are based on history. There are Roman histories like Julius Caesar, but 10 or 11 of them are English histories. 3 of them stand out independently. King John, Edward III, there's some dispute about whether Shakespeare is the author, and Henry VIII, which he co-authored with John Fletcher. The other 8 plays, however, form 2 sets of 4 plays. These sets are called tetralogies and can be appreciated as continuous stories of history. Our play, Henry IV, Part 1, is part of one of these sets, along with Henry IV, Part 2, Henry V, and Richard II. This is generally considered the stronger tetralogy, and sometimes theater companies like the Stratford Shakespeare Festival will perform all 4 during the same season. I got to see this done once, and it was really cool. One confusing thing about the 2 tetralogies is that Shakespeare wrote about later history first. It is as though you wrote 4 plays about the American Civil War, and then a few years later, you decided to write 4 more plays about the Revolutionary War. So let's consider Shakespeare's history plays very briefly. Shakespeare's first tetralogy takes up a period in English history called the War of the Roses. This was a civil war between descendants of Edward III. Henry VI gives his name to 3 of the plays as he comes to power as a 2-year-old, falls out of power, and then comes back into it. These were very early plays, and though popular in Shakespeare's day, are rarely performed individually anymore. For instance, I have only seen them as one compressed play, with all sorts of historical figures entering and exiting the plot. The capstone play, however, is very famous. Richard III is perhaps Shakespeare's most marvelous villain character, plotting as he does against so many relatives and having them murdered, including his young nephews, who he closes up in the Tower of London, where they disappear from history. Richard himself is famously killed by one of Queen Elizabeth's ancestors. Queen Elizabeth was the queen in Shakespeare's day. Richard shouts, "A horse! A horse! A kingdom for a horse!" before he's killed. Richard is seen by some of the characters as God's curse on England for the Civil War. I have seen Richard III 3 times at Stratford, once played by a woman. All memorable performances. It's a great part. The American actor Al Pacino made a movie I recommend called Looking for Richard, which is about Shakespeare in general and the play specifically. Our play is the second in a tetralogy that begins with Richard II. He was the king in Chaucer's time, if that helps you place him. As the movie I asked you to see on the politics of the play indicates, Richard ascended to the throne as a boy due to his father's death in battle. Richard was managed by his uncles as a boy, first and foremost by John of Gaunt, who just so happens to be Henry IV's father. Shakespeare's play begins with Richard, as a young man, casting off his various uncles' authority, and through a tangled chain of events actually banishes his cousin, who we will know as Henry IV, who is in that play, not yet king, and called Henry Bolingbroke. Henry returns from banishment, and with the aid of the Percy family and other high nobles, he captures Richard and forces him to give up the throne. Richard dies in captivity. If you love poetry, this play is for you. Richard is portrayed as a weak ruler with a very rich and dramatic imagination. He speaks in beautiful verse. I recall once reading that this Shakespeare play has the highest percentage of pure poetry. In our play, time jumps ahead into the early stages of Henry IV's rule. He is already plagued with troubles on the borders with Scotland and Wales, and his reign is doomed to be troubled by turmoil. In fact, the Percys, who helped him to the throne, do not believe that he has followed through on his obligations to them. For dramatic purposes, Shakespeare sets up one Percy in particular as Henry IV's antagonist. He is called Hotspur, and in real life he was actually 3 years older than Henry IV. In our play, he appears to be the same age as the heir apparent, Henry's son, called Hal. Hal begins the play with a horrible reputation, but ends up by vanquishing Hotspur and redeeming his father's trust. Of course, Hal is destined to become Henry V, the true hero of the tetralogy, in fact, all the history plays. We don't know if Shakespeare planned 2 Henry IV plays all along, or if his story just became too big, or so popular that it required a sequel. We do know that Shakespeare created an immensely popular comic character, Falstaff, who dominates, even with his size, every scene he inhabits in both plays. More about that later. Whatever the case, the story of Henry IV continues up to and including his death at the end of Part 2. The play ends with a new king, Henry V. Part 2 is frequently performed, but less often than Part 1, which contains more drama and conflict, which is in higher relief. As I mentioned before, it is not rare for large companies to offer both plays in the same theater season. The tetralogy concludes by focusing on a great hero king, Henry V. For Henry's audience, Henry V, formerly Hal, remember, was famous for unifying the country by conquering France. In actuality, Henry did gain a foothold on the continent, but it was lost during his son's reign. In fact, the epilogue of Henry V states that, quote, "They lost France and made England bleed, which oft our stage has shown." Remember, the Henry VI plays came first. Henry wonders before the deciding Battle of Agincourt whether his small army will be crushed because they are cursed by God for his father destroying his uncle. In fact, he wins a nearly miraculous victory. My favorite Shakespearean movie is Kenneth Branagh's Henry V, which I highly recommend. Great acting, beautiful score. Now, please go to the quiz, check your knowledge. I won't be marking you off for wrong answers, and you can look at the right answers after you complete it. And be sure to create a class question for our next discussion on Shakespeare's English Histories. Thanks for listening.